My name is Virginia Lladó Buisan. I'm Head of Conservation and Collection Care here at the Bodleian Libraries, and I'm also the Secretary of the Friends of the Bodleian. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really fantastic to see such a full room and such a well-attended lecture, which I think is very well deserved. Today we have as our guest speaker wonderful, and I know he's wonderful because I've worked with him on a project that involved Robert Morrison's printing plates for the volume that Stephen is going to talk about today. Professor Stephen Harris, who's Bruce Curator of Oxford University Herbaria, lecturer at Christ Church College, and Associate Professor of Plant Sciences. His main interests are plant systematics and evolutionary biology, especially of plants moved around by humans. Professor Harris's teaching is focused on field botany and conservation genetics, and he has written extensively on aspects of the history of botany and botanic illustration. His book, if you haven't seen it yet, The Magnificent Flora Greca, is worth taking a look or purchasing because it's a wonderful compendium of beautiful botanical species illustrations. Today, Professor Harris will talk about the making of Robert Morrison's Historia Plantarum Universalis Oxoniensis, 1680-1699, one of the most complex illustrated books published in late 17th century in England. Within the Bodleian Library, amongst so many other treasures, and Oxford University Herbaria, there is a vast archive of materials associated with this project. And Professor Harris will focus on how these different elements of the archive are linked and what we can learn about late 17th century botany. So I'm introducing Professor Harris to you. So please help me give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Virginia. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you today. Can you all hear me at the back? Good. What I want to do is I want to talk to you about this work of botany at the end of the late 17th century, and if I can get the technology to work, and I'm going to take you through this, talking about the place, the period, the people that were involved in its construction, what the project was all about, how Morrison tried to sell it, how he tried to get it into the public domain, and the issues that he had in terms of doing this practically. And then I want to finish up by thinking about, well, does it have any purpose today other than just a very pretty book? This is a very typical plate from Robert Morrison's work. You've got a whole series of plants that are illustrated in black and white. These are copper engravings. And then there's often a coat of arms there. And I'll talk more about what these elements mean in a moment. So, first of all, thinking about the period. We're talking about the period of the Restoration. We're talking about a period when the Royal Society had been formed in 1660, nationally. So people were interested in science. People were interested in trying to understand how the world worked. And there was a tremendous amount of optimism around. And there was money flowing in all sorts of different ways. Locally, the Botanic Gardens had been established in 1621, or at least a rock had been planted in a field, and some money had been lobbed at it. But it wasn't until 1642 that plants started to be added to that collection. We're also talking about the period when the Ashmolean was formed. So the John Tredescants were displaying their collections in London, in Lambeth, and these were then acquired by Ashmole, and then Ashmole eventually added the Tredescant collections to his own collections to produce essentially this enormous cabinet of curiosities, which became the Ashmolean Museum. So locally, there was a lot of activity, a lot of interest going on. And of course, from a point of view of science, sciences were developing, people were asking questions about plants in all sorts of different ways, in ways that they hadn't thought about them before. So they were asking the questions about what are plants? They were starting to question ideas that plants were these God-given entities that didn't change. they were starting to ask questions about how plants worked, how plants went about their lives, not just the fact that they happened to have certain medicinal properties or they were good for food. Plants were being used in much more interesting ways, or being thought of in much more interesting ways than that. And of course, there was lots of material coming in from the New World and from Europe that was flooding in to the UK, and people were trying to make sense of it. They were trying to understand how these different things actually could be grouped together. And so classification systems became all the rage. So there's a lot going on in this period, both nationally at the political sense, locally, and also purely at a scientific level. So where did all this happen? Well, all this happened within this space here. This is Logan's print of the Botanic Gardens in 1675, and you can see that there are certain elements that are still familiar to people. There's the Danby Gate here, there's the east gate of the garden, there's the west gate of the garden here, and there's this wall, there's this corner that still remains intact. Everything else has been changed, buildings have been added, but the essential elements of the garden are still there. So this is the space in which this volume was constructed, and of course it is part of a university, and it is a part of a university that is starting to become interested in plants. And one of the first things that comes out of the gardens is in 1648, so 6 years after Bobart the Elder started planting the gardens, this volume comes out. It's anonymous. By tradition, we assume that it was written by Bobart the Elder, but we don't know that for certain. It contains a list of it's part of a series of catalogues, in fact, that come out over the 17th century. And in total, there's about 4,000 polynomials. So a polynomial name is a phrase name. It's a descriptive Latin name that was used in this period for naming plants. It's not the binomial name that you're familiar with today, which is a Linnaean invention. So that idea of a genus and a species is not happening. But of those 4,000 polynomials, it's about 1,300 plants that were being grown within this space. And when we think about why those plants were there, well, the university constructed this garden, or at least provided some funding to construct this garden, and what they thought they were getting was a medicinal garden, a physic garden. They didn't. There were very few medicinal plants within this number. What they got was something that was much more interesting. What they got was a collection of plants that were primarily there to illustrate the diversity of plants, to start asking questions about plant biology itself, not necessarily how plants were important to us. Over 60% of the plants are species introductions. By that, I mean that they are species that are not native to Oxfordshire. So it's not a case of the people just going out into the field and just pulling things in. It's these plants are coming from much further afield. They're coming from Europe. They're coming from the Americas. In some cases, coming from Africa. And the important element in understanding, in fact, all of this is what the first keepers of the Botanic Garden did, the Jacob Bobarts. What they did is they constructed herbaria. They constructed collections of dried plants which they pressed and they preserved. And we have them maintained within the collections today. And there are three principal collections that are important. There's this one, which is the Herbarium of Jacob Bobart the Elder. There's this one, which is the Herbarium of Jacob Bobart the Younger, and was done when he was a young man. You might think of it as juvenilia. And there's this, which is traditionally associated with Robert Morrison, but in fact, there's no evidence that Morrison had any involvement in this at all. All of the handwriting and everything in this is of Jacob Bobart the Younger. So these volumes are essentially the work of the Bobarts. And so who was involved in the construction of this work? Well, there were academics, and we could think of as the principal academic there was Robert Morrison. There are the horticulturalists, which are the Bobarts. There are obviously the engravers. Engravers are really important in this because one of the reasons that we remember this volume is because of the images, not necessarily for whatever the academics wrote. There's obviously the printers are important, the publishers are important, and the administrators of this project would have been important if they'd have been involved at any level, particularly over the financing of this enterprise. So who were the main people? Well, the main protagonists in this are Robert Morrison. Robert Morrison was a Scotsman. He was born in Aberdeen. He was a veteran of the Civil War, and soon after the Civil War, he exiled himself to France, where he became a gardener at Bois. And it's here that he met Charles II. And when Charles II was restored to the throne, he was essentially made the king's botanist. And in 1669, he was made Regius Professor of Botany here. That was the first botany professor in the United Kingdom, and he maintained that position until he died until he was killed, in fact, in 1663. He was killed in the Strand. He was hit by a cart, a road accident, and he was very well known as a teacher. He seemed to have been quite respected as a teacher, although at least one commentator didn't like his Scottish accent, also that didn't like the way that he mangled the English language. But that's by the by. His biggest rival was based in Cambridge, John Ray. And that the relationship between Morrison and John Ray has been the subject of a lot of discussion. The other people involved I've already mentioned. These are the Bobarts. This is Bobart the Elder. This is Bobart the Younger. Both of them called Jacob, and both of them. So there's quite a lot of confusion often in the literature about which Jacob you're talking about. But Jacob Bobart the Elder was born in Brunswick. He was a mercenary. He was a pub landlord. In fact, he was appointed as gardener. He had the pub opposite the Botanic Garden when he was appointed as a gardener in 1642. And again, he maintained that position until he died. And when he died, his son, Jacob Bobart the Younger, took over the position, and Bobart himself, Bobart the Younger, was born in Oxford. And in addition to being the keeper of the collections, he was also a tradesman. He also traded in rare plants, and we have records of him moving very rare plants around the UK. And one of the reasons that he was trading in rare plants was in order to fund the gardens, because the gardens wasn't actually funded by the university until 1734. The gardens was kept running by this pair by selling the produce from the gardens. The other thing that did happen when Morrison died was that Bobart took over his duties, took over his teaching duties, and also became involved with a lot of his research duties. But importantly, he didn't get the title. He didn't get the professorial title. And neither of these individuals were ever members of the university. They were always out with the university. So what was this project that they embarked on? Well, Morrison embarked on this project. What he wanted to do was he wanted to record all of the plants that were known in the world at the time. Quite an ambitious project. He produced this project as Plantarum Universalis Oxoniensis, as I say, published. The published volumes that we have were in 1680, 1699. The plan was to publish 3 volumes, and it was to be arranged according to this classification system that he had called the Sciagraphia, and I'll explain that in a moment. And one of the things that Morrison wanted in this project was he wanted it to be heavily illustrated. And so there are 292 plates, and there are more than 3,500 plants depicted within those plates. And the plates themselves are highly characteristic. Everything is ranged on this grid, and usually, as I say, there's a coat of arms in the bottom corner. So the Sciagraphia. Sciagraphia literally means a first draft of something. And it was a classification system that Morrison came up with, which he claimed he'd taken from nature's book. In fact, he invoked 2 verses from Genesis to indicate that that was where the inspiration came from. Verses 11 and 12 in the first chapter of Genesis, where the focus is on fruits and the structure of fruits. So he had his entire classification based around fruits. And he divided this classification system, this fruit classification system, based on trees, shrubs, subshrubs, and climbers, and herbs. And of course, the first thing that he has in his classification system is that his fruit classification breaks down. He makes his first division on the basis of habit. But what he saw was essentially these groups, and it was this block here. These are the herbs, and it's only the herbs that were ever published. All of the woody material was never published. So this classification system has proved to be controversial, as most classification systems often are, but often because of the way that Morrison framed it. Morrison framed this classification system as being his and his alone, and he had not got any inspiration from anybody else. And that's clearly wrong, because this classification system bears a remarkable resemblance to part of the classification system used by Caesar Plinius, who was writing at least 80 years earlier. So he was getting material from elsewhere. He was not very good at acknowledging that. And this was something that Ray picked up on. And this was something that Ray criticised him for heavily. But he stuck to his guns, saying that this was his and his alone. So how did he try and sell this classification system? Well, the way that he sold this classification system, or tried to sell it, was he produced in 1672 essentially it was a flyer. Essentially it was a publicity document, called Plantarum Unbeli Distributio Nova, blah, 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 which paraphrases as essentially a new arrangement of umbelliferous plants with tables of kindreds and affinities uncovered by observation of the book of nature. And this was heavily engraved, and in fact it was beautifully engraved in folio. This is the frontispiece, and the umbellifers are the carrots. They're members of the carrot family, and this in fact represents the first taxonomic treatment of a family that we would recognise today. And he picked on the main character that he was going to use here, which are the fruits, and he displayed all the different sorts of fruits. And as you can see, fruit diversity in the carrot family is very high. And in fact, it's a very good character for looking at in the carrot family. So he had this system. He used this as his flyer. And he'd also got a whole load of individuals to sponsor his plates. That's what this heraldic symbol is all about. These are the sponsors of the plates. And it was the plates, of course, that are the really expensive bit in this process. And scientifically, the other thing that he did in this volume is that he developed a very early idea of an identification system for plants, an easy identification system for plants, which we now know as taxonomic keys. These are a series of mutually exclusive questions that you can go through and answer and then arrive at the identification of a particular plant. So this was the pitch, and he made the pitch to a whole load of patrons. And there's 292 plates, of which 194 of them have engravings of heraldic engravings, which we assume was the people that paid for them. We've no evidence that people actually coughed up any significant amounts of money once they got their names on these plates, but they are there. And there's a whole slew of different people, different types of people. There's lots of medics, as you might expect, given that Morrison was a medic. There's quite a lot of pharmacists. There's a lot of young people early in their career. There are a lot of people that are associated with Oxford. But just pulling out a few names from that, then we have John Danvers. John Danvers was a relative of Henry Danvers, who was who provided the money for the founding of the Botanic Garden. We have John Evelyn. John Evelyn was strongly associated with the Royal Society, was very powerful in gardening circles, and was a very important ally to have within this enterprise. We have Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle, leading scientific mind of the period, again involvement with the Royal Society. And then we have the clergy. We've got the clergy here represented in terms of Henry Compton. Henry Compton, Bishop of London, had a huge garden at Fulham Palace, and was bringing in vast numbers of really rare plants and distributing them around the place. And then, of course, perhaps the most important of the lot in this respect is Mary Somerset. Mary Somerset, Duchess of Beaufort. She was the main mover and shaker in the horticultural and plant sciences movement at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, and she has a huge coat of arms associated with one of the plates, and she's also one of the people that Bart is doing business with. That Bart is selling plants and everything to. So the volumes themselves, they're folio volumes, so they're rather substantial things. And this is the frontispiece of the 1680 volume, the first volume to be published, and it comprises each volume comprises some text, or a lot of text, and the plates, and the texts themselves have a particular arrangement, and they also have particular content, and then obviously the plates themselves are associated with proofs and also with the copper plate itself. And they were drawing on sources from a wide range of different types of material. So we can have things that we can think of as primary sources. So that might be plants that are growing in the garden, and plants that were in the herbaria, and the direct product of field work, if you like. But there's also secondary sources, which might be manuscripts, people telling you things, books. People looking at what happened in the past. But this volume is very much not an exercise in collecting together all of the knowledge about plants associated with medicinal properties and all of this type of thing. Morrison just wasn't interested in that. Morrison was really interested in the plants themselves rather than what those plants can do for us. And that's a big change from what was going on previously. What was going on previously in botanical volumes, botanical herbals, is that they were primarily focused on plants that were useful to us, plants that had medicinal properties. So there were 3 volumes that were planned, parts 1, 2, and 3. And part 1 has never been published. It exists, or part of it exists, as a manuscript in the collections in the herbaria, and there's a couple of plates there's a couple of proofs that are probably proof plates for the first volume, but that's it. The first part to be published was in fact the second part of the planned series, And there's a reason why Morrison started with the herbaceous plants and left the woody plants till last, is that he feared he was going to die before the end of the project because it was going to be so long. And he didn't want incompetent people to be dealing with the most complicated part of the setup. That's how he puts it in his introduction. And so he started on the first part, if you like, of the herbaceous part of his classification system. It was published in 1680. There's 126 plates, about just over 1,300 plants, and it covers his herbaceous plants sections 1 to 5. There were 15 sections in total. The rest of the sections were done in part 3, which was completed by Bart in 1699. And there's 166 plates associated with that. And you can see that across the style is very much the same. It's the same style within the plates. So this was a vast undertaking. It was an enormous amount of work involved. And just to take you through what a typical section within this book, so one of these 15 sections in the book, is that each of these sections was divided into chapters. These chapters were usually associated were associated with the form and the shape of the fruits. And then there were subsections within them, and then within those subsections, he had this key, which essentially was able to use to identify the species. As I say, the plants were named by these polynomials, these phrase names. So these names will mean absolutely nothing to most people because they're not the names that are used today. He would provide some general description of the section from the published literature, and then he would provide detailed descriptions of the species, including some of the synonymy that goes back. And this was a traditional practice in this period, is that you would have a plant name and then you would follow it by this great list of synonyms so that everybody knew what you were talking about in relation to what had gone before. The annoying thing was that if there was a perfectly good name that somebody else would use, there was still the habit of you creating your own name. So, and then you could say, well, this is my name for this thing that was perfectly good anyway. The other thing that was involved, he gave information about, in these descriptions, for these plants, he gave information about where they were located, where they could be found, and the time of the year when they would be doing their stuff, either in terms of flowers or fruits. And again, that's different to what went before. Then he had short sections, probably a nod to some of his funders, the medicinal properties of these plants, but they're generally not very extensive. And of course, the whole thing was written in Latin. And the thing that caused him a lot of angst, or not him a lot of angst, but other people a lot of angst, was at the end of each of these chapters, he would have this harangue, as he called them, or this the hallucinations of Caspar Bowen. Caspar Bowen was one of the one of the saints of botany of the period. So he was one of two Swiss brothers, and in 1613 he'd published a synonymy, an account of all of the plants that he then knew. And Morrison disagreed with a lot that was in that, and that went against a lot of the feeling at the time. And he spent a lot of time arguing that Bowen had got it wrong here, got it wrong there, got it wrong, and this irritated a lot of people because he very rarely gave the Bowens the benefit of the things that they got right. It was only about what they got wrong. So they do make quite interesting reading. So so this is what typically what the text looks like, but it's not the text that people get excited about in this volume. It's these things. It's these plates, and the plates, quite amazingly, the plates have survived. The copper plates have survived. They were rediscovered in 1996 by Anne Hancock and Peter Foden. And so Anne Hancock was a lecturer in English at Bristol. Peter Foden was the architect, not the architect, the archivist at OUP. And they were rediscovered in all places, being used as a counterweight for the lift in the Radcliffe Science Library. There's 291 of these plates, and they together they have a weight that's just over 1/3 of a ton of copper. And just because of the sort of sad individual I am, I've been and weighed them all. And this is what the weights look like. So the average weight is just over 1 kilo for each of these plates. But some of them get up to well over 1.5 kilos, and then some of them are just over 700 grams. So there's quite a lot of variation within these plates. The plates themselves, there are in terms of the plates, they often have an artist and an engraver identified. So there are 3 artists that have been that are identified on the plates, on 65 of the plates. The engravers are found much more commonly, 174 of the plates. And the 3 most common engravers are Frederick van Hove, Michael Burgers, and Savage. And again, Burgers appears also as one of the artists on the plates. And Burgers was one of the chief engravers for the press at the time. So this is an amazing thing to have survived. And just to give you a bit more of a flavour of these things, this is one of the printed plates. This is the plate from which it was printed. This is the front part of the plate. This is the back of the plate. The backs of these plates are particularly interesting because you can see, like here, where they were beaten out to make corrections. So it's rather different to deleting something with Word. If you make a mistake, you end up having to beat out the back of the copper plate to flatten it so it can be re-engraved. And what's potentially interesting here is to think about what's going on in terms of name changes, because most of the changes that are on these plates are associated with changes in names. That might give us a clue as to when these plates were actually engraved, perhaps in what order they were engraved. Again, there's other sort of things on these plates. So this is the plate dedicated to Mary Somerset. This is her coat of arms here. It's a whole load of mosses and lichens. Beautiful plates. But there's evidently at some point the plates have been damaged and therefore they've had to be filled in with other metals. So there's a lot of things that people interested in printing could learn from these things. But what I want to think about now is a little about the process. So what we need to so we've got our image in the book. We've got a plate that has given rise to that image. The question is, where does this image come from? And we can think of a number of different ways. It could have come from a real thing, in the sense it could have been actually drawn from life. It could have been copied from another source, or it could purely be imaginary. He could have just sat down and thought, oh, I'll just draw something that looks vaguely like what I should be drawing. And it's quite difficult to get at that sort of information, but we might be able to do that by looking at some of the herbarium specimens. So this is a herbarium specimen that is in what we call the Morrison herbarium, but we actually know is associated with Bobart. This is an image that comes from Morrison 1699, which is the volume that was edited by Bobart. And we see attached to this specimen this image here. This is a line drawing. It's a pen and ink drawing, and it is possible that this might be the model for this. These might be the models, and this could well be the model for this. You can see that there's a remarkable amount of similarity, essentially, between this image and this image, and except for the positions of the inflorescences and the leaves, they are really identical. And of course, they're reversed because of the printing process. If you look on the plate, then they are the right way round. So it might be that, in fact, this could be something associated with this. This could be an example of something that was drawn from life. And we've got loads of other possibilities for that. There's lots and lots of sketches throughout this collection, which nobody has yet linked up or tried to link up with the Morrison herbarium. Sorry, with the Morrison work. So the other thing, of course, is that when you're publishing, it's not just write, make a few prints, and then publish. There's a lot of toing and froing to get things right through, because people make mistakes at all sorts of stages. So it has to go through this proof process. And we have, again, an extensive collection of proofs, of proofs of these prints, which often bear annotations and also show where changes have been made. So for example, this is the printed version of this particular page, this proof page here, and what we can see is at some stage there's been an extra plant squeezed in. It's missing from this plate here, so it's been squeezed in. Interestingly, at least I think it's interesting, there's a bit of a gap there. It's about a gap that's big enough to fit a bit of heraldry in. So it's almost as if he was hoping that somebody was going to come along and pay up the money to cover the costs of this plate. And this is one of Michael Burgers's plates. Now, a comment of Michael Burger's work in 1786 was this. He worked almost wholly with the graver, that's the tool that was used for making the plates, in a stiff, tasteless style without genius or knowledge of the art of design. Certainly with respect to this botanical work and these grasses in particular, I couldn't disagree more with that statement. These plates of these grasses, and there's about 12 of them, are superb. There is nothing like them in this period. They are unbelievable in terms of their quality and the detail that is there. So this statement might work for some of his other stuff, but it certainly doesn't work for these plates of grasses. I suppose that also depends on whether or not you like looking at plates of grasses. So what was this? All of this work. All of this work came together. This was all presented. It was essentially completed by 1699. Well, what happened next? Well, I suppose what everybody wants to do is that they potentially want their work to either continue or people actually take notice of it. Well, one of the things that happened or didn't happen was that people didn't take notice of it. And what they did do is they took notice of Ray's work instead, who was working at the same time. Which is, none of Ray's work was illustrated, but this was very heavily illustrated. So the classification system that was adopted, that was presented by Ray, was the one that was adopted as the standard across the UK. This system was largely ignored. And that was probably because Morrison had died in 1683. The architect of the system had disappeared. His pupil, Bart, was not he was interested in the system, but he wasn't promoting it. And Also, the system in its entirety wasn't published until 1720. But the text itself and the images were used by Carl Linnaeus in 1753 in Species Plantarum. So these and this is the volume that is used as the volume for naming plants. All names published before the publication date of Species Plantarum are not considered valid, and our naming system of plants dates to this point here, the binomial system that we use. So in that respect, part of it was used, but it wasn't the bit that Morrison was interested in that was really used, the classification system. Now, the users of this volume have made various assumptions, or these volumes have made various assumptions. The first of these is that the contents of the Historia relate to the contents of the Physic Garden, the Botanic Gardens. So it represents a catalogue of the gardens. Also, there's the assumption that the Morrison herbarium and the Historia are contemporaneous. They were constructed by Morrison. And also that the images in the Historia have models in the herbaria, so that we can go into the herbaria and we can pull out the models that we used. What I want to do now is just to illustrate how those assumptions may be incorrect. So this is the very first plate in the first volume, and so what we've got is some asparaguses in there. We've got some things that would be described as bryonia, and we've got some passion flowers. Looking through these images, you can actually find where they were copied from, and almost all of them were copied from Gerard's work in 1633. So this image corresponds to this one to this one, that one to that one, and so on. These are highly simplified versions of these, but they are the same image. In this case, we've added a few fruits and a little spear of asparagus to this one, but otherwise they are the same. In the case of these two images, which correspond to that one and correspond to that one, these come from Georg Margrave's publication in 1648. What's interesting is that in this one, the flower's not included, and in this one, a flower is included, but it's not the same flower as this one here. I don't know where the flowers have been copied from yet. But so we can see that at least for this plate, all of these images were copied from other sources. And some of them have quite subtle implications. So for example, this cyclamen here from the 1699 volume was copied from Cornuti's publication in 1635 of the plants of Canada. And we can see that there's no question that those are copies. What's interesting is when you get to start looking at the detail. So a lot of detail is lost in this copy. Look for the position of that stigma there. If we look at this one, what is actually a stigma going into the center of the flower, in this one, it looks as though it's some extension, protuberance from the petal. So there hasn't been a lot of attention to detail by the copyists going on. We see another example. So this is an image again taken from the 1699 volume. This is from Plumier's work in 1693, just 6 years before this was published, and this fern, this bit of fern frond here, has been copied to produce this, and again, very much it lacks a lot of the detail that you might wish to see. And just another example. This is from 1680. And this is from Zanoni's book on some of the rare and obscure plants that were coming into Italy. And this is a species that's coming from Brazil. And you can see all these different points of correspondence. between these two images. This is a copy, essentially, of this. But details are disappearing. So, for example, there's a little stipule, the little structure associated with the leaf there, which is missing here. All of the thorns on all of the spikes, all of the prickles on this part of the stem are missing from here, and the prickles on this part of the stem here, in this case, are just sticking outwards, whereas here, and importantly, they're sticking backwards. So, and that backwards character is an important character for distinguishing between species. So there's not an awful lot of attention being paid to some of the detail in these images. And just to take it right back into Oxford, and thinking a little about the present day, Oxford Ragwort. Oxford Ragwort is something you'll all be familiar with. It's this yellow daisy-like thing that's found in waste sites around Oxford, on walls, this type of thing. Snesia squalidus is its common name. And Snesia squalidus, Oxford Ragwort, has been strongly associated with Oxford since the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century. And using a whole series of using herbarium specimens, we can plot how the species has spread over the UK, and you can see that from the beginning of the 19th century to the end of the 20th century, has been this very rapid growth. So it has spread. So this species escaped from Oxford. So the question that we are often interested in is, how did it get into Oxford? What were its entry requirements? And the reason that we're particularly interested in Oxford Ragwort from that point of view is because of the consequences that it's had for the evolution of the genus within the UK. So this is a native species in the UK, groundsel. Again, you'll be familiar with it from your gardens. But it's led to the evolution of at least 2 new species within the UK, the introduction of this species, something called Welsh groundsel and something called radiator groundsel. So it's provoked evolutionary change. This plant itself is in fact a hybrid between 2 species that occur on Mount Etna, one at the bottom of the mountain, one at the top of the mountain. So the question that we have is, what came into Oxford? Was it Oxford Ragwort, i.e. the hybrid itself, or did the hybridization happen within the UK? And part of the evidence for that has always been this image here. This image comes from Morrison's work in 1699. It's been argued that the presence of this plant and this image in 1699 in Oxford meant that Oxford Ragwort was present in Oxford at the end of the 17th century. Is that potentially the case? Well, we can look at the text. If we look at the text, we find that the text from a work by Paolo Bocconi, this work in fact published in 1674, is identical in everything but 3 words. So the text has been entirely copied from this work. And if we look at this image, what we see is that, in fact, this image has been copied from here. But bits have been pulled off it, and then you've been pulled back together. So, for example, this flower head here is this one here. We've got this group of leaves here come from here. This leaf here is this one here. This bit of the flower head here is this one here. So these two. This has clearly been copied. So there's no evidence that Oxford Ragwort was actually in Oxford at the end of the 17th century. If you get even more involved in what's written, you realise, in fact, and then look at the herbarium specimens, you realise, in fact, that this isn't Oxford Ragwort at all. This is actually the plant from the bottom of the mountain. So we're now in the position that the orthodoxy is that Oxford ragwort was introduced into Oxford from Mount Etna, from the slopes of Mount Etna, as the hybrid. The historical evidence is telling us that no, that's not the case with this analysis, that in fact, potentially the two parents were introduced and the hybridization happened within the UK. So this is just one of the things that flows out of a reinterpretation of this particular volume. So to finish off, so Morrison's intention was that he was going to produce something that was monographic, that broke with the tradition of focusing on medicinal plants, that it was going to be global and it was going to be illustrated. He certainly got something that was illustrated, and he got to some extent something that was monographic, but within his concept, it was something that was never going to finish. There's this enormous archive of material across the university associated with this project, which has really been underutilized. And I think there's a lot of potential in there from a whole load of different disciplines. And ultimately, the author's intentions were really never fulfilled. And partly that's because he died in 1683, as I say. And the other thing, of course, about this project, famously, is that it was extremely expensive. It was the project that almost drove the university press in its childhood into bankruptcy, because it was so expensive to print the plates or to get the plates engraved. And indeed, it was a publishing disaster. Vast amounts of this material was remaindered, essentially. And at one point, the university seemed to be finding it difficult even to get rid of it as waste paper. So I just want to finish up by thanking particular people of a seminar series that we had last year, I think, in fact, that was funded through John Fell funding. This is in fact the plate dedicated to John Fell. And particularly Alexandra Franklin in the Bodleian here for sort of bringing everything together and getting us to think about Morrison once again. Thank you.